We've been looking at the book of Philippians, and we're going to continue to do that even today because lo and behold, we're talking about joy in life and joy in death, and so the subject matter is very appropriate still. We began by looking at how Paul begins the book of Philippians by addressing he and Timothy as doulos, as slaves, and the members of the church in Philippi as saints. And we talked about how significant it is for us to assume both of those roles, to recognize that we are slaves of Christ and in turn to allow Him to make us holy and to continue to strive for additional holiness in our journey. He then talks about the fact that they had been partners with Him, they had fellowship with Him in the gospel. We spent some time dealing with the fact that the partnership that is real and deep and joyful is not a partnership that is based upon our own opinions and our own choices and preferences. It's a partnership that is welded together by the gospel truth. And so Paul says that's what he shares with this body of believers in Philippi, and thus they travel the journey joyfully. He talks about the fact that what has happened, he is confident that God is going to bring to completion that which he began. That they're not living with a disaster mentality, that they are living with a divine overseeing, that God is working in them. He then talks about his care for them, talks about praying for them daily. He addresses the fact even about what he prays, that their love might abound more and more, that their discernment will grow, and that they'll be able to process and to distinguish between those things that are truly significant and important. They'll be able to understand the things that are bearing. We then looked at the fact that Paul says, I can look at the events in my life, I can look at them as calamity, or you can gain courage. And he praises them because what's happened to him is imprisonment and spreading the gospel while in prison. That's given courage to those that are around him. And then Paul gets into a very revealing section when he talks about his personal joy even amid people who are seeking to do him harm, who are trying to discredit him, that as long as Jesus' truth is being spoken, he will rejoice, and he will continue to rejoice. And there's nothing you can do to take away my joy in that. So he's very profound in his commitment to the gospel being shared. We began last week to talk about joy in life and death. We identified that, what Paul really has said already and continues to reveal in this little short book about living a joyful life is that it all boils down to us being consumed with Jesus, to Him being number one. By the way, how many of you checked to see if you touched your smartphone the appropriate number of times this week? Last week there were several afterwards that said, I don't touch my smartphone 5,740 times. I don't do. And then some began to process that. If you have a smartphone, if you have an iPhone and you haven't done the thumbprint so you can get into it, how many times do you have to touch it just to open it up? And then you think about touching this and touching that, and you know what? It adds up very, very quickly. But we get consumed with some of those kinds of things. And our lesson last week was challenging us to become consumed with Jesus. And we spent time in prayer, your private prayer. You petitioning God to help you to be more consumed with spiritual things. And I trust that that's been a positive experience in your week, that He has aided you in that process. Today we want to continue on. I'm going to go to verse 18 of Philippians chapter 1, and we'll read through verse 26. What does it matter? Paul's talking about these people who are teaching Christ despite him. Just that in every way, whether out of false motives or true, Christ is proclaimed, and in this I rejoice, yes, and I will rejoice. Because I know this will lead to my deliverance through your prayers and help from the Spirit of Jesus Christ. My eager expectation and hope is that I will not be ashamed about anything, but that now, as always, with all boldness, Christ will be highly honored in my body, whether by life or by death. For me, living is Christ and dying is gain. Now if I live on in the flesh, this means faithful work for me. And I don't know which one I should choose. I am pressured by both. I have the desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary for you. Since I am persuaded of this, I know that I will remain and continue with all of you for your advancement and joy in the faith, so that because of me your confidence may grow in Christ Jesus when I come to you again. So Paul says initially, I've got joy in living. And let's look at some of the elements that Paul identifies as those things which bring him that joy in living. His belief is that Jesus is so primary to every activity and event in his life that his source of joy is inexhaustible, it is unquenchable, and it's even eternal. Paul's saying that there isn't anything that can happen to me that's going to be destructive to the joy that I'm able to live with. I want you to note that Paul is living with every expectation of deliverance. That's what he tells the Philippians. I don't think I'm going to remain in prison. I don't think my life is going to be taken. I believe that I'm going to be of service still. We're going to be reunited, that there's going to be continued work for us to accomplish. That's what Paul believes. The original here carries the idea, Paul says, I believe I'm going to be rescued or to be safe. It's from a root word that means delivered, and oftentimes in Scripture it's a word that's used of God or Christ. So Paul says, I think I'm going to be delivered. And even in the choice of that word, he's saying, I think Christ is going to get me out of this situation. I perceive that's what's going to happen. Paul's joyful confidence grows from a number of things. One of the things he mentions is the prayers of the saints. He has joyful confidence in life because the saints are praying for him. Have you ever had anybody just come up to you and say, I'm praying for you? Numerous times people have shared that. And it's so overwhelming to know. There are people who tell me that they're praying for me every day. And you know, I can't think about that very long because it's just overwhelming. And here's Paul, and he says, I have every expectation that I'm going to be out of this situation, that I'm going to be back to engaging in the things of life that bring me joy because of your prayers. I have every expectation of that. I want to share something with you. This fascinated me, and I trust it will you as well. A cardiologist named Randy Bird decided he was going to do an experiment. What he decided he was going to do is he was going to divide over a period of time his patients into two categories. One category, made up of 192 patients, were the prayed for group. The other group, 201, were the not prayed for category. Okay, so he's doing this on his own. His patients, he's dividing them up into those two categories. Now, the patients themselves, the doctors who worked with them, the nurses had no knowledge of these group assignments. In other words, nobody knew anything that was happening but him. He then organized various prayer groups throughout the nation. And he sent those people first names, diagnosis, and prognosis of the 190-some patients who were on the prayed for list, and asked these prayer warriors to engage in prayer for those patients and their situation. The results were so dramatic, they actually got published in the American Heart Association. The prayed for group had fewer complications from their issues, their cardiac issues, and there were fewer fatalities in that group. Among those who were not prayed for. Okay, here's where the information I found shared some statistics. They were 5 times more likely to develop infections that required antibiotics. 5 times more likely. And the only difference in the two groups was one group was being prayed for, and one group was not. Same kind of care, similar circumstances, and they were 3 times more likely to develop lung infections, which obviously become of great concern with cardiac situations. Prayer. Paul says, I'm confident. I'm confident. I have the expectation that I'm going to be delivered from this situation because you're praying for me. Great power in prayer. But not only does Paul have the confidence because of the prayers of the Philippians, he says, I also have this confidence because of the help from the Spirit of Jesus Christ. So it's not only the prayers of the saints, it's the work of the Spirit for Jesus that leads Paul to have this confidence. Part of being consumed with Jesus is recognizing His Spirit and presence in assisting us in life's journey. It was the Spirit, you remember, who came upon Jesus immediately after His baptism, and it was the Spirit who led Him away into the wilderness to be tested. The Spirit was involved in Jesus finding joy on His journey. So today, those who are God's children are open to being led by the Spirit also. We read this in Romans, for if you live according to the sinful nature, you will die. But if you live by the Spirit, you will put to death the misdeeds of the body, and you will live. Because those who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. So one of the things that you and I can engage in to have joy in this life is the same thing that Paul engaged in, and that is surrendering to the Spirit's leading us. The Spirit does that in any number of fashions, but our surrender to that leading is what is significant. The Spirit's leading will always direct away from fulfilling fleshly desires and toward a life that is more consumed by Jesus. A good evaluation, am I allowing the Spirit to lead me, to direct me, is where's my life going? Is it becoming more consumed with Christ, or is it becoming less? And if I'm being led by the Spirit, I should be becoming more consumed with Christ. Paul in Galatians chapter 5 outlines much of this very plainly when he talks about how the sinful nature is contrary to that of the Spirit. They're at odds with each other. And then he goes ahead and he says this in verses 24 and 25. Those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the sinful nature with its passions and desires. Since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit. We have taken out the desire for sinful flesh to be fulfilled and gratified. So since we've done that, and we've said that we're going to live by the Spirit, then we need to keep in step with the Spirit. That's what the challenge is. Paul said, I trust that I'm going to get out of this situation. I'm going to be able to experience joy in life because you're praying for me and because the Spirit is leading me. Let's look at these verses and we'll move on to Paul's joy in death. For me, living is Christ and dying is gain. And if I live on in the flesh, this means fruitful work for me, and I don't know which one I should choose. I am pressured by both. I have the desire to depart to be with Christ, which is far better, but to remain in the flesh is more necessary for you. Now, Paul is going to transfer. He's just said, I have every expectation of experiencing joy in life. By your prayers and by the leading of the Spirit, I believe I'll be able to still do what I've been doing, and it'll result in your benefit. But, guess what? I have joy regardless of whether my expectations come about or not. I have joy even if death is a result. Paul is very emphatic in his belief that death would bring gain. And the idea of that original word is it's more lucrative. It's of greater profit. Death is more lucrative to us than life. And Paul said, that's where my joy lies. And so, yes, I can have joy in life, but I have something more lucrative to look forward to, so that's just as joyful. He says he has a desire, a longing his heart is set on, to depart, to break away from, to be with Christ, which he says is far better, it is greater, and it's from a root word that means vigor or might. It is much more vigorous to die and be with Christ than it is to be in this life. My joy will be different. It will take on a wholly different nature when I am in the might of Jesus. Because Jesus has conquered the power of death, only He can offer a joy that transcends the boundaries of death. I read something this last week, and it was so significant. Charles Colson. If you were born after Watergate, that name probably doesn't mean a thing to you. Charles Colson was involved in the Nixon administration. He wrote, and I'm paraphrasing, but he wrote one time and he said, I believe that Jesus was resurrected because of Watergate. I believe in the empty tomb because of Watergate. And then he proceeds to say this. 12 men told about a resurrected Christ for 40 years, and nobody could destroy their story. He said 12 men tried to uphold a lie for 3 weeks and couldn't accomplish it. Speaking of Watergate. I believe in the empty tomb because of Watergate. These guys weren't lying. And so here we find Paul saying, Jesus has conquered death, so there's joy beyond. And I look forward to that joy. One could say that his conquering death was not only his joy, but it's the joy he wanted to share with those who were willing to die with him. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Let's recognize the flesh is going to try to drag us down, but we need to continually set aside that desire. We need to live by the Spirit. And then the Hebrew writer says, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith. Jesus perfected faith in God's truth to resurrect him. He perfected that. And so we keep our eyes on Jesus, who for the joy set before him, you recognize that from our theme, right? The joy set before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. You see, Jesus has joy beyond death because he put his faith in his Father. And he perfected faith by bringing about that resurrection. Now, since the children have flesh and blood in common, he also shared in this, so that through his death he might destroy the one holding the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who were held in slavery all their lives to the fear of death. You see, Paul says, I can have joy even if death is my outcome, because Christ has destroyed the fear of death. Paul has already met the resurrected Jesus once, and it changed his life. You know, I just had a moment in my office as I was thinking about this. Paul has already met the resurrected Christ. And it changed not only his name, but it changed his entire life direction. And I wonder what would happen in our lives if we truly felt like we met the resurrected Jesus. Appreciated Chris's words around the supper. You know, it's easy for us to think about a crucified, a dead Jesus, a sacrificing Jesus. But he's a living Jesus. And if you and I came into contact in our hearts with the realities of a living Christ, how would our lives be changed? What would happen to us? Paul has already come to face with the joy that lies beyond death. He knows that already. The Lord appeared to him and said, Saul, why are you persecuting me? He knows. He knows. His life purpose is consumed with those eternal joys. So, as a result of that, Paul says, you know what? I'm torn. I'm torn. I have complete joy in my physical life and my existence, and I have complete joy in the possibilities of death. There was the joy of living on in the body. He said, if I live on in the body, it's going to be in Christ. That Paul is consumed. He's consumed. If I live on, it's going to be fruitful labor for me. The idea is that there'll still be a harvest to pick. Something can still be planted, something can still be harvested, so it'll be fruitful labor for me. He also tells the Philippians that it's necessary for you that I remain. And that's an interesting word in the original language because it's compounded from up and arm. So I'm not sure if the idea is I'm going to be able to hold you up. Or if my leading forth with my arms up, if that's going to blaze the trail, it's going to be necessary for you. He also has joy in living on because their progress and joy in faith compounded from he wants to be in front or to chop. So if I live on, I'm going to be able to lift you up, and one of the ways I'm doing it is I'm going ahead of you, and I'm preparing the way. I'm making the progress. I'm in front, chopping down the things that are in your way. So he says, I'm torn. I know that living on is going to do this. And Paul says that their reunion will progress the joy of their faith. But he's also torn because he wants to go and be with the Lord. He recognizes that is gain, he calls it. That he has a desire to depart, a longing to break up. I have a longing to break up. My joy will be complete in death. He also says it's far better. It's interesting, in the actual Greek, the word much appears twice. It is much, much better. It is much, much better to depart. Richard Baxter says this, my knowledge of that life is small, the eye of faith is dim, but it's enough that Christ knows all, and I shall be with him. Joy in death. We know very little about heaven, but a believer once described it as an unknown region with a well-known inhabitant. And that's a pretty good way to think of it, isn't it? An unknown region with a well-known inhabitant. John writes about it. He got a glimpse of it. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth. And the old heaven and the old earth had disappeared, and the sea was also gone. And I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven like a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. I heard a loud cry from the throne, saying, look, God's home is now among his people. He will live with them, and they will be his people. God himself will be with them. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death or sorrow or crying or pain. All these things are gone forever. And the one sitting on the throne said, look, I am making everything new. And then he said to me, write this down, for what I tell you is trustworthy and true. And he also said, it is finished. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To all who are thirsty, I will give freely from the springs of the water of life. All who are victorious will inherit all these blessings, and I will be their God. They will be my children. Paul says, I have joy in the prospects of dying. A little girl was taking an evening walk with her father. She was amazed at the particular brightness of the heavens that night. And she asked her dad this question, Daddy, if the wrong side of heaven is so beautiful, what must the right side be? Paul said, I have joy. And my joy will sustain me in all opportunities of life. Imprisonment doesn't take it from me, because you're praying for me and the Spirit is leading me. There is nothing can happen in this life experience that will remove that joy from me. And you know what? Death won't do it either. Death actually brings a different kind of joy, a renewed kind of joy. Joy in life, joy in death. Softly and tenderly, Jesus is calling. I hope he touches his phone 5,700 times to get in touch with some of us. He is calling. And Sam has asked for us to just sing the chorus at the end of the last verse. Jesus is calling all of us to experience the joy of life. John says he came to give life and to give it to the full. He did that by bringing about our forgiveness. He did that by inviting us to come under his leadership, be in his body so he could be our head. He did that by preparing a way for us to follow, going through death, perfecting faith, and experiencing the joy of a resurrection. If there's something in your spiritual walk that is amiss and you want to correct that today, you want to come back, you want to be made right, this would be a great opportunity to do that. For today, Jesus softly and tenderly calls us all.